When Debbie was 7 years old, her parents died in a car accident. At that moment, she was at home with her grandmother, Abigail. Unfortunately, they had to sell their apartment because they needed money for Debbie's parents' funerals and for her future. The remaining amount from the sale of the house and the funeral expenses wasn't enough to buy another property. Abigail fell into depression due to the loss of her son, and only Debbie's presence somehow saved her from sorrow. Abigail tried to find any job because they were really short on money, but being a pensioner, no one would hire her. So Debbie and Abigail had to live in a small village. It took about an hour and a half from Debbie's school to the village. At first, Abigail didn't want her granddaughter to waste time and money on commuting. She suggested Debbie attend the local school, but then remembered that Debbie's school was public, so there was no fee, unlike the local one. Almost half of Abigail's pension would have gone to pay for that school. Besides, since Debbie was now an orphan, she was entitled to benefits, allowances for the loss of both breadwinners and free public transportation. So Debbie ended up living with her grandmother. At first, they walked to school together. Then, as Debbie grew older and more confident, she started going alone. Though sometimes Abigail would become anxious. Her granddaughter was going to the big city. What if she was attacked by criminals or deceived by fraudsters? Debbie would come straight home after school. They didn't have the time or money to visit museums, theaters, or other places. Abigail's pension and Debbie's allowances weren't enough for them to live comfortably. Plus, the train ticket to their village always required payment, even with a discount. They also had to do homework, and almost all the money went towards Debbie's school supplies and clothing, as she was growing rapidly. As Debbie entered her teenage years, the emotional burden grew heavier because new subjects were introduced in school, and the difficulty level of the curriculum increased. She tried her best to excel academically so they wouldn't need to hire tutors. They only went to the city during vacations. They could only visit cafes or restaurants on birthdays or Christmas. Soon enough, Abigail started experiencing health issues. It was evident as the woman was soon turning 80 years old. When Debbie was in 7th grade, her grandmother realized that she was inadvertently limiting Debbie's horizons. Due to her worries, Abigail would instruct her granddaughter to come straight home after school. She would get anxious or scold Debbie if she was even a few minutes late. Moreover, there were few prospects for her granddaughter in the village. Though why lie? There weren't any prospects there at all. Debbie needed to live in the city, where there were many opportunities. There she could pursue higher education, get a good job. Civilization, after all, was all within reach. Cafes, museums, theaters, peers her age she could be friends with. Despite Debbie befriending everyone in the village, they were mostly weekend visitors. There were few children in the school, and they left the village after elementary school to attend city schools because their parents, like Abigail, didn't see any prospects in the village. And the education in the local school wasn't as serious as in the city. And those kids came from stable families. They could provide for themselves, unlike Debbie, who only had her pension or grandmother. They couldn't save up to buy an apartment, and nobody would approve a mortgage or loan for them. Abigail didn't even consider renting an apartment. Debbie grew up as a very modest girl. She didn't want to leave her grandmother who had taken care of her for so many years. Recently, she had started thinking about getting a job, even just as a shop assistant. But her grandmother said that Debbie should focus on passing exams and prepare for them carefully. Perhaps, thanks to her exam results, she could get into a good university, and then she could start working. Summer vacation began. Debbie and her grandmother modestly celebrated the start of the holidays with apple pie and cherry juice. The next day, while Abigail was preparing in the kitchen, she suddenly felt unwell. Her heart started hurting and she felt dizzy. She nearly fainted. Worried, Debbie called the doctors, and they arrived promptly. They determined that she was overworked and advised her to rest more. They also prescribed the necessary medication and left. Abigail checked the prescribed medications and felt disheartened. They would have to go to the city to get them, and they were expensive. All her money would have to be spent on them. Debbie realized that something needed to change in their lives, and finding a job couldn't be postponed anymore. Yes, she needed to prepare for exams, but her only family member was unwell. If Abigail didn't improve, Debbie wouldn't be able to handle it. She couldn't imagine living completely alone, without parents and without her grandmother. Her grandmother needed care now. Debbie went to the city and started looking for job advertisements. However, her searches were unsuccessful. Suddenly, someone called out to Debbie. It was Gabriel, her school friend, 3 years her senior. She suggested Debbie come into a cafe and have a chat, but Debbie politely declined, explaining that she was looking for work. Gabriel looked excitedly at her and said she could help her. Despite Debbie's initial refusal, Gabriel insisted they go into the cafe and explained to Debbie that she worked part-time at the hospital and they were currently in need of a cleaner. "Are you interested in such a position?" Gabriel asked. Debbie instantly agreed and thanked her friend profusely for her help. The girls went to the hospital and spoke with the management. The head doctor of the hospital wasn't opposed to Debbie's candidacy, but noted that since she was only 16 years old, she could work for 5 hours, and the payment would be accordingly. Those were the rules. Debbie agreed to any conditions as long as there was money. At home, Debbie told her grandmother everything. Abigail, although glad that her granddaughter was growing up, didn't like Gabriel, and it seemed as if her granddaughter got the job through connections. Abigail also worried that Debbie would tire herself out too much. Well, it was only June now. School wouldn't start soon. Perhaps, in 3 months, they would save up a significant amount that would ensure them a peaceful life. Every day, Debbie came to the hospital to clean floors, and at the end of her workday, she either went to the pharmacy to buy medicine for Abigail or to the store to buy groceries or some desserts to treat herself and her grandmother. Mostly, Debbie handed over the remaining money from the purchases to her grandmother, and she modestly accepted them, but secretly set them aside for her granddaughter. Thanks to the medication, Abigail felt much better. Nevertheless, she was still anxious about Debbie, and now this Gabriel appeared. Abigail considered her spoiled, because in her childhood memories of Debbie, Gabriel behaved arrogantly towards the other children, including Debbie. She made boys or girls carry her backpack or textbooks, could make harsh remarks to children, offend them with words, and never apologize. How did it happen that her granddaughter and this girl became friends? Abigail was amazed. And now Gabriel had also gotten Debbie a job through connections, which Abigail didn't approve of at all. She was afraid it might harm her granddaughter. What if Gabriel later reminded her that Debbie now owed her something? And besides, weren't there any other, more decent job vacancies? Abigail thought that given Debbie's age, wiping tables and washing dishes in a cafe was better and more profitable than cleaning floors in a hospital. What if Debbie caught something there? Gabriel is shameless, Abigail thought. Despite such judgment, Gabriel was helping Debbie a lot now. She showed her new routes to get to the village, told her where things were sold, what discount cards were available, how to navigate the city, whom to avoid and be wary of, where not to go, especially in the evening. She advised Debbie to get a map where her salary would be credited. Abigail surprised Debbie. She gave her granddaughter part of the money she had saved. Let her buy herself a mobile phone so she could notify her grandmother about her plans or whereabouts. Previously, Debbie and Abigail had postponed buying a phone because, firstly, they didn't really need it, and secondly, mobile phones were very expensive. Abigail started to get used to her granddaughter going to work in the city, so she allowed her to stay there longer so she could take a stroll, go to a cafe, or visit something, eventually make some friends. Abigail asked Debbie not to give her salary to her but to save it for herself, for example, for new clothes or other desired items. After all, it was her money. Debbie tried to socialize with the city kids her age, but as soon as they saw her slightly worn clothes and lack of makeup, they either immediately said they had to leave or simply ignored her, casting disdainful glances her way. It didn't work out to hang out with Gabriel because her shifts at work weren't every day, and she came to the hospital after classes at the institute, when Debbie's workday was already over. Besides, Gabriel hinted to Debbie unmistakably that she wouldn't find it interesting to hang out with her. The doctors, nurses, and other hospital staff were much older than Debbie. They had their own important matters, and among them were those who looked down on the cleaner from the village. Although after her cleaning, the wards and corridors were perfectly clean, which the head doctor couldn't help but appreciate. Unfortunately, Debbie had no one to hang out with, or even to be friends with, and she didn't want to visit any events or places alone. It was too boring. About a month into her job, a young guy was brought to the hospital. He had failed to brake properly on his motorcycle, fell off it, and narrowly avoided death. Now he was in a coma, but there was a chance he would survive. His helmet saved him. The young man was about 19-20 years old and had a striking appearance. When Debbie saw him for the first time, she was amazed and froze for a moment, unable to take her eyes off him. He was like a prince from a fairy tale to her. In the following days, as Debbie cleaned the floors in his ward, she admired the young man. She even began to feel like she was falling for him. And Gabriel noticed how her friend looked at the patient. The guy's name was Daniel. His parents were wealthy, but they died several years ago, and he was now the heir to a whole holding. "He's rich, he probably won't even notice you, and love at first sight doesn't exist," Gabriel said, slightly offending Debbie. When Abigail heard about this conversation, she asked her granddaughter not to pay attention to Gabriel. It was still uncertain how this guy would react to her. Debbie sometimes talked to Daniel, imagining that he was listening to her, only he couldn't respond. She told him about the weather, about her grandmother, about the doctor's forecast for his health, about which university she wanted to attend. Debbie said she really hoped to meet him, so she was waiting for him to wake up. Daniel started to breathe easier. One day, Debbie saw two people come to him. Judging by their clothes, they were businessmen, and Debbie thought they might be Daniel's relatives. They spent some time in his ward, then went out into the corridor with the doctor. The doctor said the young man's condition was stable, and he might wake up in a couple of days. Debbie mentally rejoiced at this news. The doctor left. The guests began to discuss something about the holding. Then one of them went back into Daniel's hospital room, and when he came out, Debbie suddenly heard a strange phrase. "That's it, the guy's a goner and the holding will be ours." Debbie almost screamed in horror. Fortunately, the men didn't see her as she had hidden around the corner. What did "the guy's a goner" mean? Why did these two people bury Daniel in advance? Debbie began to listen carefully because she felt that these two were plotting something very sinister. The men discussed that the guy was going to die soon, and the holding would legally and by will belong to them, the board of directors. As it turned out, the man had added poison to the drip. He's still too young, he won't be able to manage the holding adequately and with dignity. Did they really decide to kill Daniel? Apparently, her grandmother was right that there are still scoundrels ready to commit crimes for money. The men left. Debbie quietly slipped into Daniel's room, approached the IV drips to disconnect them, but for a moment she hesitated. What if she made things worse for him? But then she imagined burying him without even getting to know him. She was afraid of being scolded, fired, or even arrested for her actions, but the fear of Daniel not surviving was much stronger. With trembling hands, Debbie disconnected him from the IV. Nothing happened. 15 minutes passed, then half an hour, almost an hour, and Daniel still didn't wake up, but his breathing remained steady. Debbie became even more frightened, but she was also afraid to leave his room. She wanted to make sure Daniel was okay. She completely forgot about her job. After several more agonizing minutes of waiting, Debbie, trying to sound calm and look confident, asked Gabriel to tell the bosses that she would stay at the hospital overnight. Her friend was extremely surprised, but she complied. Fortunately, the chief physician didn't inquire about the reason for the delay. Then Debbie called her grandmother and said she needed to stay at work. She returned to Daniel's room and sat next to his bed. Debbie waited for him to wake up. Night fell, and Daniel's eyes remained closed, but his breathing continued. So, he was alive. Debbie couldn't take her eyes off the young man's beautiful face. She really wanted to see the color of his eyes. Debbie didn't notice how the night passed and morning came. Suddenly, she noticed that Daniel moved, and his eyelids twitched. Debbie almost screamed. She wanted to shout, jump, dance, but she restrained herself out of propriety. But to express her joy somehow, Debbie kissed Daniel, and it seemed like the guy responded to the kiss. His lips moved slightly when they touched hers. Debbie felt embarrassed. She left the room and returned to her work. It was then that Debbie realized she was very hungry. There had been no dinner or breakfast. and she needed to let Abigail know that she had fallen asleep right at her workstation. It was even funny. After some time, when all the staff had gathered in the hospital, everyone was amazed to find that Daniel had regained consciousness and was able to sit up. He was disconnected from the IV. Daniel told the doctors that he thought there was a girl next to him who kissed him. The chief physician remembered that Debbie had wanted to stay at the hospital the previous evening. Gabriel, also remembering Debbie, briefly felt annoyed with her friend. What had she done? The chief physician called the girl into Daniel's room and asked her what happened yesterday. Debbie honestly told about the two businessmen who wanted to kill Daniel and had put poison in the IV. Daniel looked attentively at Debbie as she recounted. The chief physician ordered to check the patient's IVs. The girl was right. They indeed contained poison. Daniel would have died that morning if it hadn't been for Debbie's intervention. This was a real attempted murder. The chief physician called the police. Investigators took Debbie's testimony about the conspiracy of the two businessmen. Then the chief physician gathered all the staff to find out who had set up Daniel's IVs. More precisely, from the records, it was determined who had been on duty in the boys' room in recent days. However, all these employees denied their involvement in the attempted poisoning of the boy, and there were no cameras in Daniel's room or the hospital corridor, so it was impossible to determine exactly who these businessmen were. Daniel, upon learning from the chief physician who exactly had visited him, told the police that he believed Debbie. Those two directors have a motive to kill him. His father owned the holding company. By will, in case of his death, the holding passes to his children, in this case, Daniel. But if he's not around either, then the holding goes to the board of directors. Daniel also noticed that his late father didn't speak highly of these two directors. Moreover, after his parents' death, Daniel felt they were trying to befriend him. They also tried to convince him to temporarily hand over management of the holding to the board of directors, because they have more experience and understanding than he does. Investigators went to the directors, questioned them, but both claimed that the attempted poisoning of Daniel was a lie made up by some teenage cleaning girl. She's only 16, so she's fantasizing. Investigators felt the businessmen were lying to them, but at the same time understood that indeed, there was too little direct evidence. They only had testimonies from Daniel and Debbie, no other witnesses. It wouldn't be possible to find out the truth from the hospital staff either. Firstly, many people had access to the IV. Secondly, none of the employees had any poison found on them. The businessmen are unlikely to allow their homes to be searched. By the time the police get a search warrant, they would have disposed of any evidence if they haven't already. Police officers came back to Daniel and explained that they probably wouldn't be able to arrest these directors. Daniel replied that he wouldn't file a complaint against them, but he now needs protection to prevent a possible second poisoning attempt. In the following days, Daniel was accompanied by two personal bodyguards and the chief physician, who personally administered medication into his IV to ensure the patient's safety. Surprisingly, after the police arrived, those two businessmen didn't visit Daniel anymore but claimed to be very concerned about the future director of the holding company. Debbie continued to mop the floors in all the rooms, including Daniel's. He trusted her, so he allowed her to come in. However, Debbie now found it difficult to admire him. She felt embarrassed under his gaze. Daniel occasionally glanced at Debbie, but if their eyes met, they quickly looked away. Both were feeling awkward. A week later, Daniel, fully recovered, returned home and decided to take action. The very next day, he became the owner of his late father's holding company. He remembered that those two directors wouldn't be imprisoned due to lack of evidence of their crime. In the following days, those two directors unmistakably tried to hint to Daniel about his young age and inexperience in business, or to take some of the responsibilities onto themselves. However, Daniel's father had taught him from a young age how to run a business properly. So despite his age, he knew what needed to be done. Moreover, the other directors of the holding company treated Daniel with more respect, and no one tried to impose their thoughts on him. One day, Daniel summoned the two directors to his office and insisted on selling their shares in the business. The men were greatly outraged. On what grounds did their newly appointed director make such a demand? They were not willing to give up their stakes. This was precisely the reaction Daniel expected. He then asked them why they reacted that way and why they had wanted him to hand over his management to the board of directors. Perhaps they really had tried to poison him. The businessmen began to explain that they had spent many years building his father's business, and now they were practically being kicked out. They again mentioned his inexperience. Nevertheless, they gave in under Daniel's pressure. They were experienced. They would find other jobs, maybe start their own companies. The businessmen sold their shares and left the holding company, but before leaving, they told Daniel that he was making a mistake due to his young age. Daniel's grandparents from both sides came to see him, Martha and Martin on his father's side, and Hadley and Jaron on his mother's side. Martha and Martin were in another country and didn't immediately learn about their grandson's accident. And when they tried to come to him, they faced problems with flights. Hadley and Jaron also didn't immediately learn about their grandson being in the hospital. They lived far from the city, but nevertheless they were all ecstatic that their grandson was now okay. Learning about the attempted murder, they decided to stay in the large house on the outskirts of the city near the forest. Daniel's entire family usually gathered in this house for holidays. For 2 weeks, Daniel didn't let anyone except his grandparents, bodyguards, and close family near him. He didn't want to return to his apartment, from which he used to travel to the university. He still needed to explain to his professors why he had been absent from classes for so many days and hadn't completed his coursework. He decided to give up motorcycle rides. He didn't want to end up back in the hospital, which, as his experience showed, could be unsafe. Then he started thinking about his savior, Debbie. He noticed she was still very young. Yet, she didn't hesitate to save him, unplugging the IVs, telling everything to the police, even kissing him. And somehow, at her age, she's working as a cleaner in the hospital. Daniel speculated that she needed her own money, or her parents made her work. He wanted to get to know Debbie better. Moreover, he thought it was somewhat unfair. She saved him, and he hadn't properly thanked her. Daniel went to the hospital, found Debbie, thanked her for saving him and helping him, which made her blush, and struck up a conversation with her. Daniel found a kindred spirit in Debbie when he learned she had lost her parents, just like he had once. Debbie admitted to him that she worked in the hospital because her grandmother had health issues, and you can never have too much money. During their conversation, Daniel discovered that some things about Debbie's grandmother and her life seemed familiar to him, and he remembered that she had spoken to him while he was in a coma. He asked where exactly Debbie and her grandmother lived, and was surprised to learn that their home was far from the city. Daniel felt sorry for the girl. Despite her smiling face and cheerful voice, it was evident that she needed help. You couldn't earn much money as a cleaner, and her grandmother was a pensioner, not to mention sick. Besides, Debbie had to travel a long way to get to work. A couple of days later, Daniel offered to drive Debbie to her village. He assured the girl that it wouldn't be any trouble for him. Debbie didn't agree immediately, but she eventually accepted. After all, public transportation wouldn't get her home quickly. While the young people were driving, there was initially an awkward silence. Then they started talking about their preferences. Daniel noticed that Debbie's knowledge was a bit limited, but he didn't blame her for it. Her life situation was different from his. Abigail was very surprised to see her granddaughter stepping out of an expensive car, but then her surprise turned into delight when she learned that Debbie was brought home by the guy from the hospital she had fallen for. "Gabriel even said he wouldn't pay attention to you," Abigail remarked with a smile. The loving grandmother already knew the story about the attempt to poison the guy, and at first, she was a little worried about her granddaughter because she didn't want her to get into trouble. Those businessmen were criminals, and if they dared to pour poison into the dying guy's IV, they could very well find Debbie and seek revenge for her revealing their secret. But fortunately, they didn't show up in Daniel's life, or even more importantly, in Debbie's life anymore. Later on, Daniel started giving Debbie rides home. One day, he suggested going to the movies after her work. Debbie agreed and didn't regret it. They hardly ever went to the movies with her grandmother, since the show times were usually inconvenient for them. After some time, Daniel invited her to eat at a cafe she had long been curious about. The next day, he invited Debbie to a restaurant where she tried Asian cuisine for the first time and was delighted with it. Gabriel noticed several times that the former patient of their hospital was meeting and giving rides to Debbie, and she became a little jealous. Debbie, a girl from the village, modest and unassuming. But a wealthy young man was interested in her, not Gabriel, who had been living in the city for a long time, dressed in expensive clothes, and had some work experience, albeit minor. Once, when Daniel brought Debbie over again, Abigail invited the young man into their home for dinner. They had a pleasant time together. Daniel was growing more likable to Abigail, and the young man enjoyed spending time with Debbie and her grandmother. Despite their small and modest-looking home, it was very cozy. Later, Debbie suggested that Daniel come over for the weekend and swim in the river. The young people had a great time and didn't even want to part ways that day. Daniel was willing to spend the night at Debbie's and her grandmother's place, and they arranged a bed for him, although he insisted on sleeping on the floor. Daniel liked being there. It was simple, warm, and cozy. That's how Daniel became friends with Debbie and her grandmother. One day he found that the faucet in their bathroom was broken. Daniel called a plumber who fixed everything and paid for the repair. Abigail was grateful to the young man but gently scolded him. They already owed him enough. Daniel explained that he was trying to repay Debbie for saving him, so it was him who owed her. With a smile, Abigail remarked that good deeds don't demand gratitude, and their friendship with Debbie might already be the best gift. Friendship. Daniel pondered, was it really just friendship between him and Debbie, considering she had kissed him? He felt drawn to Debbie by her simple and kind nature. Yes, Debbie had spent most of her life in the village. Her horizons weren't as broad as his, but perhaps it was precisely because of her life in the village that she had become who she was now. Kind-hearted, sweet, and selfless. He didn't bring up the kiss out of politeness, and Debbie was sure Daniel didn't even remember it. Daniel's grandparents had long noticed that their grandson would disappear somewhere and return happy. They figured he must have found a girlfriend and started asking about who he had fallen in love with. Daniel told them about Debbie, but only mentioned that she saved his life in the hospital. His grandparents were impressed and immediately wanted to meet her. Daniel was delighted and decided to arrange a meeting at their house. He didn't go into details about Debbie's family and work, thinking that they would all get to know each other and find out everything during the visit. However, Daniel's relatives were astonished when they saw the 16-year-old girl, without makeup, with a simple hairstyle, and in ordinary modest clothes, rather than Daniel's peers with jewelry and in expensive suits. They thought Debbie was very modest, so she came to the meeting looking like that. Debbie, on the other hand, was amazed by the large and luxurious house and the food on the table, but was a little shy around people she didn't know. During dinner, out of politeness, Debbie immediately expressed her admiration for their home, and Martha, who didn't understand her enthusiasm, asked where she lived. When Debbie honestly answered that she lived with her grandmother in the village, everyone except Daniel looked at her with surprise. Jaron asked Debbie about her parents, and she admitted that they had been gone for a long time. Her grandmother had raised her for 10 years. Martin, who was beginning to dislike Debbie's biography, asked where she worked. Debbie replied that she was currently working as a cleaner in the hospital. Martha and Martin almost dropped their cups. Jaron and Hadley were also amazed. Hearing about Daniel's friend, they imagined her as a nurse with a decent income. They were already dreaming of him marrying her, but it turned out that Daniel's friend was just a child who had no home and family of her own and was working as a cleaner. The meal continued in almost complete silence. Everyone, except Daniel, started to ignore Debbie, and it began to weigh heavily on her. Daniel tried to start a conversation about her studies and her future. Debbie supported him, but it didn't elicit any reaction from the others. Then Martin suddenly recounted how one of his friends suffered because of a girl from the village. She spent the night with him, got pregnant, and gave him an ultimatum. Either she gets an abortion or he marries her and provides for her and their future child in his apartment. Now this man is forced to support this girl and their child. Debbie felt very uncomfortable. Were they really comparing her to that shameless girl? Debbie assured them that she would never stoop to such deceit. Martin just smirked sarcastically. Martha looked disapprovingly at Debbie, while Jaron and Hadley pretended to be focused on their food. Daniel was furious at his relatives' behavior and mentally blamed himself for not telling them about Debbie's situation earlier and arranging this meeting. Then Martha told Daniel that she had seen several charming girls abroad who could become Daniel's friends, or maybe even his partners. Daniel looked at his grandmother with annoyance, and Debbie sincerely couldn't understand what she had done wrong. She quickly finished her tea, asked Daniel if there was a bus stop nearby, and Martin replied that there was one not far away, so she should hurry. Debbie quickly thanked them for the meal, apologized, and headed towards the exit of the house. Daniel followed her, offering to at least drive her to the city. Debbie declined, not wanting him to quarrel with his family, and left. Martin told his grandson that this girl was still young and she had no prospects. Daniel angrily remarked that he and Debbie were just friends, not engaged, already planning their wedding. Debbie told her grandmother about the unsuccessful meeting with Daniel's relatives. Abigail asked her granddaughter not to pay attention to them. She's dealing with Daniel, not with them. But mentally, the grandmother was upset with the tactlessness of Daniel's relatives. They judge people by their status, not by their character, and they allow themselves to be rude. Impudent rich folks, she thought. Autumn was approaching. Debbie and Daniel realized that they would see each other less often due to their studies. The chief doctor at the hospital, understanding that Debbie needed to study, said it was time for her to leave them, but he was pleased that she had worked with them. Debbie was upset. She had saved up a small sum from her salary, which would last for a few months, and then they would be completely out of money. Relying on Abigail's pension made no sense. Daniel learned about this, although Debbie didn't want to impose her problems on him, especially after meeting his relatives. Daniel offered Debbie his help in finding a job and also his apartment for accommodation, from where she could quickly commute to both work and school. Debbie wanted to refuse, thinking that living in her friend's apartment was too much, but Abigail said she approved of Daniel's plan, and they could see each other on weekends. "You don't have to worry about me and my health anymore. I'm feeling better, and I can go to the city myself and buy all the medicines I need," said Debbie's grandmother. Abigail realized that her granddaughter had found a reliable protector. She saw that Daniel was a wonderful guy, despite being wealthy. Debbie, on the other hand, thought this was her chance. After all, she had been living off her grandmother for almost 10 years. Abigail needed a break. She had given Debbie everything she could, taken care of her. It was time for her to relax and live for herself. Daniel helped Debbie move into his apartment. He showed her around the apartment and explained how to use the appliances. Debbie preferred to sleep on the couch or on the floor, which Daniel didn't like, so he insisted that she sleep on the bed while he slept on the couch. Later, Daniel's grandparents found out that Debbie had moved in with their grandson into his apartment, which enraged Martin and shocked Martha. Jaron and Hadley were more embarrassed. They had actually liked Debbie from the first meeting. They just preferred to keep quiet about it. Martin tried to evict Debbie from Daniel's apartment. He came to the apartment while she was alone. He ignored her polite offer to make him tea. He told her that it was his apartment too, so she should go back to her village, and gave her half an hour to gather her things. Debbie timidly refused, wanting to wait for Daniel first, and Martin then loudly shouted at her not to defy her elders. Debbie got scared and started packing, but after a few minutes Daniel arrived and immediately realized that his grandfather had come to evict his girlfriend. He told him to leave them alone. Debbie was afraid that they would both be kicked out of the apartment, but Martin just looked disdainfully at his grandson and headed for the exit. He said that from that day on, Daniel couldn't count on his help. Martin left. Debbie got scared and told Daniel that his grandfather, as the owner of the apartment, would simply kick them out. Daniel just smiled back and said that in reality, the apartment belonged to him alone according to the documents. His father had taken care of his son's future, and he inherited all the property. Martin had no rights to the apartment, and he couldn't boss anyone around here either. Debbie calmed down. Later, she learned that Daniel's grandparents had left and promised to come back for the holidays. Well, Hadley and Jaron promised, while Martin and Martha just sent a message about their departure. Daniel noticed that even the big house was now at their disposal. Soon, Debbie realized that living in Daniel's apartment was indeed convenient in terms of location. The school was within walking distance, just 2 bus stops away, as was her new job. Debbie got a job washing dishes and wiping tables at a restaurant, just as her grandmother wanted. She also diligently maintained order in Daniel's apartment, bought necessary food for the 2 of them, and cooked. It wasn't her place, but she was generously allowed to live here. After all, she needed to thank Daniel somehow. Daniel made sure Debbie didn't overwork herself. He often noticed that she was studying and working too hard, and on top of that, she was trying to do something in the apartment. He asked her to take better care of herself. He didn't want Abigail to scold him, as she had entrusted her granddaughter to him, and Debbie was now always tired. Debbie continued to give part of her earnings to her grandmother, but Abigail discouraged her from doing so. Abigail now lives alone. She takes care of herself and buys everything she needs. Her pension is quite enough for her. But it doesn't mean that the granddaughter and grandmother got rid of each other. Their lives have just changed. Debbie has a boyfriend now, and they live together. Abigail often looked cunningly at Debbie and Daniel when they visited her. The groom and the bride, she thought. On Abigail's anniversary, Debbie and Daniel surprised her by taking her to an expensive restaurant, where they had a celebratory dinner with champagne, and for dessert, they presented the birthday girl's favorite cake. Abigail didn't expect such a wonderful birthday. She cried with happiness and thanked Debbie and Daniel. During breaks between classes, Daniel and Debbie went to cafes, restaurants, movies, exhibitions, and theaters. Sometimes on weekends, Debbie stayed in the city to visit another place, or the young couple visited other cities together. Abigail didn't mind that her granddaughter didn't always come to visit her on weekends. On the contrary, she was glad that she was truly living her life now, not just following a tiresome routine. The relationship between Debbie and Daniel was not like that of neighbors, but like that of close friends. They didn't get on each other's nerves, there were no complaints between them, and the age difference wasn't that big, so their interests aligned. That's when Debbie realized that Gabriel just didn't want to hang out with her, so she made up the excuse that they wouldn't find each other interesting. The young couple felt that they loved each other. They even kissed at the hospital, although the kiss was fleeting. However, they decided not to give in to their feelings just yet. Instead, they hugged and kissed each other on the cheek because both of them had studies to focus on. Daniel had to defend his thesis in a year, while Debbie had final exams to pass and university admission ahead. She had already chosen an interesting specialty for herself and was now putting all her effort into exam preparation. Debbie has a chance to break through to a new level, Daniel thought. Why deprive her of all this? He, as the envious ones at school used to say, was born into a wealthy family. He always had money, while Debbie's best times were just beginning. She no longer needed to spend 1.5 hours on the road and worry about always running short of money. She could now hang out after school or visit different places instead of immediately returning to her village. Over time, Debbie became more confident. When she turned 17, she insisted on being appointed as a waitress at a restaurant. She celebrated her birthday with her grandmother, Daniel, and Gabriel at the restaurant, and they all had a great time. Abigail didn't even pay attention to Gabriel. It was at this celebration, amid applause from the grandmother and a couple of guests, that Daniel kissed Debbie on the lips. This time consciously, not in a state of coma. Gabriel was a little envious of Debbie because she found herself a wonderful and wealthy guy. After the celebration at Daniel's apartment, Debbie was pleasantly surprised when Daniel confessed to her that he remembered the very kiss that helped him wake up. Debbie then kissed him on the lips again and thought it was the best birthday she ever had. Her beloved confessed his love to her, and they kissed twice. Daniel celebrated his birthday with Debbie, his relatives, and friends on a large boat. The best moment of that day was dancing with Debbie on the deck to beautiful music. The next day after the celebration, Martin asked his grandson if he had changed his mind about Debbie. His grandson replied that they were in a serious relationship. Most likely, they would get married because they were happy together. Martin decided to approach Debbie again and hint at her background, but this time Debbie told Martin that he shouldn't talk to her like that. Yes, she grew up in a village, but she was smart and well-mannered. And as soon as she turned 18, she would find a better job than being a cleaner or a waitress. Martin was shocked by this response. He didn't say anything, just adjusted his tie and left. He dared not say anything against Debbie anymore, which made Daniel very happy. Debbie passed all her exams successfully. Daniel's support was very helpful to her. After all, he had passed the exams long ago. He had experience. And he explained to her what to pay attention to and how not to panic during the exams. Then Debbie applied to university, and fortunately, she was admitted on a scholarship. Debbie was almost in tears of happiness. She had been working towards this for so many years, and she succeeded. To celebrate passing the exams and entering university, a small party was organized, which Debbie's grandmother also attended. Abigail was proud of her granddaughter, and her joy for her was immeasurable. Daniel was also proud of Debbie for overcoming herself, stepping out of her comfort zone and achieving her goal. She never asked him for anything. Debbie remained as good and selfless as she always was. As soon as Debbie turned 18, she managed to find a part-time job in an office. Her salary became a little higher, and she was gaining work experience. At first, Daniel wanted to suggest that she not work at all, as their relationship was progressing, and they were already planning their wedding. He was the owner of a conglomerate, so there should be no financial issues. But remembering her life with her grandmother, Debbie told him that she didn't want to be completely dependent on him financially. Debbie believed that both men and women should earn money. Daniel decided she was right and thought that Debbie would become a reliable and loyal wife. In the summer, Daniel and Debbie went abroad together for a week. Debbie began to realize that she adored the sea the most, so she preferred vacations near it. Her relationship with Daniel grew stronger. They had wonderful nights together, but they were rare and always with maximum protection. At the end of her second year at university, Debbie was promoted, and no one could ever think that this girl once grew up in a village. Debbie wanted to renovate her grandmother's house, but Abigail laughed and said that her house could only be demolished now. "Better you and Daniel build your own house," Abigail said with a laugh. "Just be sure to build a big house so your children have plenty of room." Debbie felt a little embarrassed when her grandmother mentioned her future children, although she knew perfectly well that she and Daniel would get married. As for the house, Daniel wasn't worried. He believed that the house he inherited was suitable for living. They also started to spend a lot of time there. It was beautiful and cozy, luxurious, but not overly so. Debbie particularly liked the living room with a fireplace and comfortable armchairs, and outside there were rose bushes, a garden, and a swimming pool. By that time, Martha and Martin began to see Debbie not as a little girl from the village, but as a promising, responsible, and serious young woman. However, Debbie didn't get close to them yet. They didn't inspire trust in her. Daniel's relatives also met Abigail. Hadley and Jaron immediately liked her and admired her. Martha and Martin tried to keep their distance from Abigail at first, but then they discovered that she was a very intelligent, cultured, and educated woman. Abigail didn't impose herself on them as a friend. She listened attentively and could give them advice. Then Daniel's relatives began to doubt that only illiterate people lived in the village. On Christmas Eve, Daniel, his relatives, Debbie, and her grandmother celebrated Christmas together in a big house. Then Daniel presented his gift, a diamond ring, and proposed to Debbie, who happily accepted and kissed the young man. In early July, after Debbie graduated from university, the young couple got married. The wedding was beautiful. Daniel wore a gray suit, and Debbie wore a white dress with an airy skirt resembling a rosebud and a light veil fluttering in the wind. Abigail could barely hold back tears of happiness. Her granddaughter looked so beautiful in her wedding gown, and she got such a wonderful husband. At some point, the loving grandmother had despaired that she wouldn't live to see this day, but she understood why the young couple had waited so long to get married. First, there was studying and working, along with testing their relationship and life together, and then building a family. The newlyweds had a wonderful honeymoon by the ocean. Although they had been living together for 7 years in Daniel's apartment, they wished their honeymoon would never end. Their love was so strong and tender. Upon returning to their homeland, Debbie discovered that their family would soon be growing. Daniel, his relatives, and Abigail were overjoyed. Early February. A 6-year-old boy and Daniel were building a snowman in the backyard. Debbie was holding a 3-year-old boy. When the spouses found out they would become parents, they decided to spend most of their time at home so that their children and themselves could enjoy the fresh air. One of the advantages of the village was the clean air. Debbie knew this for sure. Even when she was finishing her second year at university, she realized that remote work was becoming popular. But back then, she didn't dare to take such a job because of memories of her life in the village with her grandmother. However, when she learned about her second pregnancy, she decided to take advantage of the opportunity to work from home. Fortunately, with her many years of experience, she had access to any job with any schedule. It turned out that such work was very convenient. Abigail was ecstatic when she saw her first great-grandchild. The loving grandmother, now a great-grandmother, even looked better over the years of Debbie and Daniel's marriage. They paid for her trips abroad and stays at health resorts to improve her health. Looking at her, it's hard to believe she's already 88 years old and has 2 great-grandchildren. Daniel became very close to Abigail, sometimes even calling her grandmother. The spouses eventually renovated her house, repainted the walls, and updated the furniture. The bed, table, and chairs no longer squeaked. They also added a microwave and a robot vacuum cleaner. Daniel's grandparents also adored their great-grandchildren. Martin had changed a lot. He became kinder and more peaceful. Unfortunately, Hadley didn't live to see her younger great-grandson. She passed away from a heart attack. Debbie looked at her husband, her sons, their home, and felt happy. The only regret was that her parents couldn't see her now. They would have been friends with Daniel. Sometimes she felt like that life in the village with her grandmother, when they scrimped on everything, was just a horrible dream. Abigail thought the same way, but they both understood that it was their past and were glad that life had changed for the better thanks to Daniel. "Mom, how did you and Dad meet?" unexpectedly asked Debbie's elder son. The spouses looked at each other and laughed. Their first meeting was quite interesting, at the hospital when their dad was in a coma. But the boys wouldn't understand all the nuances. They decided to tell the children their story in a fairy tale genre. Like a sleeping beauty, their dad slept under a spell. 2 wicked bandits plotted against him and tried to kill him, but before their attack, a charming girl came to him, kissed him, and he woke up. He defeated the bandits and married the girl, and they lived happily ever after, and then they had 2 sons. And they all lived happily ever after.